What is going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back from my vacation and ready to make more videos diving in to these old retro Yu-Gi-Oh formats. And to start off with, I'm going to cover something that I missed while I was gone, which is the Joey-Pegasus Tournament Finals from the Jinzo Jackers 2 tournament over on Format Library. Now, I'll be going into the general coverage of the format later in the video, but I wanted to cover the finals because I wasn't able to stream them since I was away. And I do think that these finals are pretty interesting as they're between Ellie Tinkan and PJ Darkness, who are two very good duelists in this format. For those of you fiending for more Fiber content, don't worry, I'll have more Fiber videos later on in the week. And also, we are going to have a Fiber tournament starting the Discord server this Saturday at noon. So definitely head on over to the Discord server and sign up for that if you are interested. But I do feel like these sorts of finals are important to cover as they are potentially meta warping for future people playing these formats. And, more discoveries in these things can lead to different outcomes in the future. So I do think it's important to just go through these games and watch what's going to happen. And unlike streaming live, where we don't know either of the players' hands, I figured since we are just commenting over a replay, I'm going to show both players' hands and see how that goes. This is a new sort of commentary for me, so let me know how you enjoy it down below. But we're going to start off with this game one, and it looks like PJ will go first here. And as a note, PJ was sort of favored to win entering these games, as PJ was from the winner's bracket, which means that they hadn't lost a match up till this point, which meant that Ellie Tinkan would have to win 2 matches against them in order to win the tournament. But in PJ starting off with a very good hand, which is very unfortunate for Ellie, they're going to go for a confiscation, seeing what Ellie's got here, and they're going to pitch that Gemini Elf, the one monster that Ellie can actually use at this point. They're then going to go for a Graceful Charity here, drawing 3 and then discarding 2, and man, those are some good draws. They're going to discard a Trap Hole and a Gemini Elf. The Trap Hole likely because, Ellie can't really bring out a monster to play into that. And I think they are going to go for a Magician of Faith play here, potentially getting back the Graceful Charity later. They've also got Call of the Haunted to bring back that Gemini Elf later. They're just going to set the Harpy's Feather Duster, set the Magician of Faith pass. I think that this is a very good move. Harpy's Feather Duster is good, but it can also bait the other Harpy's Feather Duster that Ellie has. And you don't really care as much about Torrential when you've got like Call of the Haunted that you want to preserve to bring back a monster later. And Graceful can also give you ways around that Torrential as well. So I feel like this is a good bluff. If Ellie doesn't go for Harpy's Feather Duster here, then PJ can potentially snipe that Torrential. But it looks like they are indeed going to go for the Torrential. Fire a Change of Heart, which is very unfortunate for PJ, and now Ellie will be able to get back that Change of Heart, tribute off that Jinzo, and attack in for 2400. So this play kind of backfired for PJ here. Kind of unfortunate. I mean, it had to be Change of Heart off the top to really do that, but it was, and that can happen in these formats. As I've said in the past, sacking is a part of these. And it looks like this will ultimately turn out fine for PJ, though, as they'll be able to Change of Heart the Jinzo and attack in with a Jinzo of their own here. Fisher, however, will deal with that Jinzo, and Ellie's going to set this Torrential, drawing another Torrential tribute as a backup, which is very nice. PJ's going to bring out that Bazoo, and that's going to die to Torrential. PJ will set the Call to bring back Jinzo likely later. And Forceful's a pretty decent draw there. That's going to be a Dark Hole. Ellie's going to set the Torrential here, and PJ's just going to bring back that Jinzo here in battle phase, hitting in for 2400 and shutting off the Torrential. And this is a pretty bad spot for Ellie to be in. PJ's going to pass back to Ellie. Snatch Steal, however, will make this a lot better for them. They'll be able to attack in for 2400 here, and PJ will gain 1000 next turn, but I mean, it's in a really tough spot for them, as if they had any monster here, Ellie could Change of Heart it. And yeah, it's just not good. So PJ's just going to set this Delinquent Duo as they can't afford to activate it now. And Gemini Elf will indeed wrap up the game here. So that will be the end of game one. And, very back and forth and very swingy. Joey-Pegasus is a format with a very high level of swinginess, a lot of power cards, and not too many ways to stop them. So, there can be sacking on both ends, and I think we did see that in that first game there. But that's part of the fun of Joey-Pegasus. I know a lot of people don't enjoy that aspect of it, and that is very fair, as, it can make some games unfun. But if you're just looking for like fun back and forth anime style action, then Joey-Pegasus is a good format for you. PJ's going to open up with a forceful, shuffling back a confiscation here. And then they're going to go for a delinquent duo. I don't necessarily like this ordering of the hand rips. I think that in general for the hand rips, you want to fire the duo first, and then fire the forceful or confiscation or what have you. If you fire the duo first, then you could potentially hit something really good with it, and then you can also decide based on what your opponent has left what to take back. Whereas here, I think it's a bit iffier. I mean, I get going for the forceful to potentially shuffle back a serpent and then making the duo good. So I do think that is a potential good reason to go for this order. But in general, I do just like to go for duo first and then forceful back whatever remains potentially. So that duo is going to go through, and they're going to hit the painful choice, which is very good. And then Ellie's going to discard the Jar of Greed, which is easily the least impact card in their hand. PJ's just going to set a scapegoat here. Forceful Sentry will take back that Gemini Elf. I think maybe PJ should have summoned the Elf just to play around Forceful. But I don't know. It prevents Ellie from shuffling back the Raigeki. So that's good, I guess. But yeah, it's interesting plays here. Very monster light on both sides. PJ's going to go for a Pot of Greed, set a Skull Lair, pass back to Ellie. And Ellie draws a Sinister Serpent, which they're just going to set and pass back to PJ. PJ's going to set a Serpent of their own here and pass back to Ellie. And Ellie finally draws a monster, which they are going to commit to board and just attack into that set. It's a Sinister Serpent, so nothing will happen there. PJ will add back that Serpent in the standby phase, always important to remember to do, and then go for a Dark Hole here. They'll hit the Elf and the Serpent, and I think that's a misclick there with the Scapegoat, but it probably won't end up mattering. They're going to set one and pass back to Ellie, and this is actually interesting because that could easily be a Serpent set, and Ellie likely will have the read that it is. So what they could potentially do here is summon out Kaiku, reborn another monster, and then hit over their set, try Kaikuing in directly to potentially get rid of the Serpent. It looks like instead they're just going to go for a Serpent of their own, trying to hit over that Serpent there. Unfortunately, since it's Magician of Faith, they will not be able to do that, and they'll take 100 from that play. They'll pass back to PJ. PJ will fire that Pot of Greed they got back off of the Magician of Faith and summon out a Mystic Tomato. You might wonder why they didn't go for like a Jinzo here. And I think it does make sense as, you know, this way it doesn't die to like Raigeki. And also you don't want to shut off your own traps. So, I mean, Tomato is also kind of a hard card to die to Raigeki. You don't necessarily want that to happen. But I think ultimately it is fine. I was just going to set one pass back to PJ. PJ is going to go for the Graceful Charity with the Serpent. That's a killer combination here. And PJ is going to discard the Jinzo and the Serpent here. It seems like Ellie doesn't really have much back row, so that makes sense. And Bazoo is going to banish 3 from PJ's graveyard. Yeah, the 2 hand rips are a bit less valuable here in the Magician of Faith. Has basically no value in grave. And PJ is also going to do... Oh, actually, this is the end of the game. Wow. Yeah. Because that's 49-63... and yeah, I think that will be the end of the game because, yeah, Serpent. Yep. And there we go. So that's game 2. I think that game did a good job of showing how explosive turns can be here in terms of just getting a lot of damage on board. Because that is really what happened there. And it's what makes, like, every deck in this format so threatening. Like, I know that Hayabusa OTK is a very popular choice for, like, a sort of rogue deck that you'd play to do well in this format. But I feel like, honestly, it's unnecessary because you don't need that sort of OTK power when a regular deck can also OTK, just given the amount of powerful cards in the format. Ellie's going to start, and no monsters again, but that Jinzo there, I think for the 3rd time in a row. But they've got an Imperial Order and a Torrential Tribute, which is pretty good to start with. PJ's going to start by firing a Confiscation here. That will trigger the duo, not the duo, the Order. And then Ellie's going to clear up that Tomato with a Torrential. Ellie does have a Sinister Serpent here, which they are going to commit to field. They can potentially tribute it off for Jinzo next turn. And PJ is going to bring out this Gemini Elf that will clear the Sinister Serpent. And PJ is actually going to set 2 here, I guess. Yeah, I guess the duo is maybe less valuable here than it would be otherwise. And also you might want to bait out like a Heavy Storm or Harpies to get the Imperial Order drop. So I think that does make sense. Elliott's going to open a Jar of Greed. And they're going to pay another 7 to keep the order on field. They're going to set the Serpent and the Jar of Greed here. And, oh, that's interesting, not committing the Kaiku to field. I guess they're playing around like a Mirror Force or something like that, but I honestly think something out the Kaiku could be pretty good. just to clear up the graveyard a bit and get aggressive. I mean, if that is Mirror Force or Torrential, like, you've lost 2 cards, which is annoying, but you've got Snatch Steal plus Jinzo to deal with whatever monster they bring out. So I feel like, honestly, you could just go for the Kaiku here. Yeah, maybe that's a bit of a misplay here. I don't know. You also might want to just preserve a monster in hand in case there is a way to clear the elf, but I feel like just getting aggressive is super good in this format. He's again going to pay the 700, bring out a Bazoo here, and they're going to attack into the Gemini Elf here, dealing 300. And then they're going to set this called the Haunted and pass back to PJ here. PJ's just going to bring out this Kaiku, which will deal with the Bazoo there. And it looks like Ellie's going to pay for it again. I mean, they do have the Kaiku here to clear the, not the Kaiku, they've got the Gemini Elf to clear the Kaiku here, which makes sense. They'll be able to attack in for another 1600 with the Bazoo. And PJ's forced to just set the Serpent and pass. That Imperial Order's put in a lot of work here. And Ellie's going to keep it up. I mean, they've got the aggressive pressure. PJ really needs a trap to deal with this field. Or I guess another elf would kind of do it, but at this point, not really. And another spell is not what they need. They're just going to set a Serpent, pass back to Ellie, and I think this should just be the end of the game here. And yep, that's just what they're going to do. They're going to keep the order up to prevent a Scapegoat activation. And yeah, this will be all she wrote. So I think that these games showed off some important aspects of this format, the explosive nature of it, just the sackiness of it, and also in this last game, how dominating Imperial Order can be. Crazy, crazy card this format, and oftentimes you can just coast to victory off of activating it and just sitting on it. I do think that there were some things PJ could have done here to potentially win this game 3, but I mean, they were up a match at this point, and there still should be one more match in this sort of set to determine who the real winner of the tournament is. So let's dive into that and see how that one goes. Okay, we've got the next match of the Ninja Jackers tournament here, and it's actually kind of interesting because I feel like most of the finals matches that I've shown off on this channel actually do go to match 2 when it's double elimination, which is kind of fun to see. But as is, it looks like Ellie is going to go first here, which does put them at a slight advantage for the match overall. We'll have to see if that actually does come up, and they will win. I mean, I'm not trying to say that they won just because they went first, because both players are very good. I'm just saying that in this format, going first is very, very big. And, you know, you're not always going to lose every game you go second, but, man, going first really does help. It looks like, though, you know, Ellie did have the confiscation, which is very important here, but they didn't have more hand rips than that. So that's, you know, at least nice from PJ's perspective. PJ does have the painful choice here to potentially get some good stuff of their own. They're going to send 3 hand rips and 2 Jar of Greeds. I think that's a really good play. Ellie probably didn't want to give them the hand rips, and the Jar of Greeds are like fine. They cycle through your deck a little bit more, so I think this is pretty good. Also, the hand rips are pretty bad late game, so I think that this is a pretty good play here. PJ is going to bring out a Gemini Elf and just hit over that set there. It is a Witch. Ellie will search out a Kaiku because they already have the Bazoo in hand to deal with that Gemini Elf. PJ is going to set 2, pass back. Ellie has the Jar of Greed here, and also a Mystical Space Typhoon in the end phase, and that's going to hit a Mystical Space Typhoon of PJ's own. And looks like PJ is going to bring out this Kaiku, activate a Fissure, and just attack in for 18. This may be a bit risky if PJ did have like Imperial Order, but I think Ellie had enough hand knowledge to know that they didn't, so this is actually completely fine. And Kaiku is going to banish those 2 hand rips in case the Faith tries to get them back. Now there's an Imperial Order, so PJ will set the Imperial Order, set the Magician of Faith here, and pass back to Ellie. But Ellie's in a very good position. They've got the aggressive edge here, and that looks pretty good. So Bazoo will come down, and it will banish 3. And let's see how this goes. Looks like Ellie's going to choose to attack with the Kaiku instead of the Bazoo, prioritizing damage over banishes, which I think does make sense given that there aren't too many high-value cards in PJ's graveyard here. And if it's like Magician of Faith, that can get back a spell anyways. And it looks like it is the Magician of Faith. PJ's going to add back that painful choice, as the others don't really do much here. I mean, you could Comfy, I guess, but then Ellie can play around the Comfy, so I do think that painful choice probably is the correct play here, although it's kind of iffy. There wasn't really a good choice there, so I think it's fine. PJ is going to go for a Jar of Greed here, and then fire this painful choice to deck thin likely before going for the Graceful. Also to potentially get a Serpent to hand for the Graceful. And it looks like that will indeed bring the Serpent to PJ's hand. They're going to fire this Graceful here and draw 3. Discard the Serpent and 1 more, and that could potentially get them back in the game here, although it's kind of iffy. they don't have the best options here, and that not knowing that trap is kind of rough. I mean, the Mystical Space Typhoon is here, so they might want to just shotgun the Mystical Space Typhoon in case it's something like Mirror Force. And it looks like they are indeed going to do that. However, they do get a bit punished here because Call of the Haunted will be able to bring back the Magician, or not the Magician Faith, the Witch of the Black Forest here. So Ellie will be able to get a search of a Bazoo here. And this is pretty rough for PJ. I think they do have some plays. They're going to Change of Heart that Bazoo, bring out a Mystic Tomato in attack, which is interesting. I feel like that's ultimately fine. I mean, yeah, it's probably fine. They're probably not losing next turn. But it does mean more damage, which is kind of iffy. It looks like Ellie's going to bring out a Kaiku here, banish 3 to buff up that Bazoo, and then they're going to hit in. So that Kaiku will deal with the first tomato here, banish the Jinzo and the Serpent, and then PJ will be able to get out another tomato here, which Ellie can attack over with the Bazoo for 1100. So they're dropped down to 2200, which is very risky. They've got Witch of the Black Forest, which is pretty decent, but they're going to need some pretty good stuff here to actually win. Monster Reborn can be decent, but there's not really a good monster to bring back that can clear the Bazoo and the Kaiku in one swoop. So it's kind of tough. I think you just do go for the Monster Reborn. Targeting Gemini Alpha, I guess, to clear the Kaiku here. Although that's kind of weird. Mirror Force will be able to deal with that anyways. And this will likely be the end of the game, as that Imperial Order will not be able to stop a major aggressive push from Ellie. And I think as Ellie, you probably do just want to go for it. You've got Pot of Greed for follow-up. And also you can just go for your draws now. And try and draw Mystical Space Typhoon or something to deal with that back row. Oh, well, there's the IO. So now Ellie knows that they can attack in basically with no fear. But yeah, I think PJ probably had to do the IO there just because, you can't let Ellie draw things that can let them win the game if they don't have a way to win the game there. But yeah, I think that showed some of the power of going first. Ellie knowing PJ's hand was very useful, and it really did let them to basically play that game very, very well. And managed to pull out a W there. Let's see if they can keep up the wins going in this game too. Although, just like I said in game 1 with Ellie having the advantage, PJ now has the advantage here. So let's see how this actually goes. Interesting. Duo and Graceful in hand here. I think you probably go for the Graceful first and then fire the Duo. But you could potentially go for the Duo to inform your Graceful discards. So I think that there's an argument for either sort of order here. But it looks like they are going to go for the Duo, and they're going to hit out a Mirror Force. I was going to think about what to discard. They're going to discard a Fisher. So now they're going to go for the Graceful, and you have a bit more information for what you can maybe discard here. They're going to discard a Gemini Elf, figuring that maybe the discard of the Fisher means that Ellie's got other, monster removal. Although in that case, maybe you didn't want to discard the Gemini Elf because you want more monsters to eat through that monster removal. But it's kind of iffy here. They're going to just set a Mirror Force and pass back to Ellie here. Ellie's going to go for a Pot of Greed, and those are some pretty good draws, especially with that Forceful there. Sending back the Raigeki. And let's see what they do here. They could just set the Magician of Faith to get back the Pot of Greed. I think that's probably the best choice, especially since you know that PJ doesn't have Raigeki. And yeah, it looks like that is what they're going to do. They're also going to set the Snatch Shield. Snatch Shield's a good bluff because, if your opponent fires Spell and Trap removal on it, it would have died to the Spell and Trap removal anyways. So I feel like this is a pretty great turn from Ellie. PJ is indeed going to fire that Mystical Space Typhoon, but again, that would have eaten the Mystical Space Typhoon either way. They're going to bring out a Gemini Elf and reborn back another Gemini Elf, getting it pretty aggressive here. They're going to hit in to the Magician of Faith. Ellie will get a Pot of Greed here, and PJ will be able to attack in for 1900. Main two, they're just going to set the Mystical Space Typhoon, pass back to Ellie. That Nobleman of Crossout is kind of rough in this situation, but it could potentially come up later. Yeah, this is kind of rough for Ellie. They're just going to set the Serpent, Imperial Order, Torrential Tribute, and Jar of Greed. Now, if PJ does commit another monster board, that Torrential Tribute will be insane here. But let's see if they actually do. They've got Pot of Greed, so they can fire that. Ellie does have the Imperial Order, but that Mystical Space Typhoon will eat up that Imperial Order. And Raigeki is a pretty good draw there for later. They're just going to attack in for 1900 with the Gemini Elf and just pass back to Ellie. You don't need to set the Scapegoat now, as, you can't actually activate it given what you've got on field. So I think this makes a lot of sense. Ellie draws a Mystical Space Typhoon, which will not do anything for them here. They're going to go for a Jar of Greed, try to draw into something good. Gemini Elf can maybe clear one of their Gemini Elves, but it looks like they're just going to go for a triggering of the Torrential Tribute by summoning out this Sinister Serpent, which I think does make some sense. PJ draws a Torrential Tribute of their own. They're just going to set this Scapegoat, though. And, you know, that was the correct thing to do, I think, because they had the read that Ellie might be on a Mystical Space Typhoon here. And you want to bait out that end phase Mystical Space Typhoon with something that you can actually use. And in this format, you can actually use quick play spells to turn their set. So they are able to use that Scapegoat, get some value there. Although it does make their Torrential potentially worse for later. It looks like Ellie's just gonna wall up, setting this Serpent and passing back to PJ. Makes sense. You can preserve your beaters from the triangle in case, you know, PJ commits another one to field. So, for instance, if PJ commits Kaiku, you can summon out Gemini Elf. And yeah, so I think it makes sense to hold them. And a Witch of Black Forest is pretty good here. It looks like Ellie's just going to set that, pass back to PJ. And PJ's going to go for the Dark Hole here. Very interesting. That will clear Ellie's board. But now PJ can get a bit aggressive with this tomato. I'm not sure if that was the correct choice or not. You might have just wanted to save, you know, the Dark Hole for later after Ellie's eaten through a bit more of your board. But you don't want Ellie to be able to OTK you potentially. So I think that makes sense. Ellie's just going to set the Serpent, pass back to PJ. And PJ's going to go for this Forceful Sentry. So now they do know that the set is Serpent here. They're going to take the Bazoo, which makes sense. Taking the Kaiku is kind of useless here. And I mean, between Gemini Elf and the Bazoo, you want to take the Bazoo because the Bazoo can clear Gemini Elf, which is your out to Kaiku. So I think that makes sense. PJ's going to set the Torrential here, and Ellie draws another Gemini Elf. I think Ellie might just want to get... Oh, no, they're just going to set one. I guess they're afraid of back row, which makes sense. PJ's going to set one and then attack into the set. I guess this is playing around Morphing Jar, which makes sense. And Ellie's going to grab back that Serpent yet again. Nomen of Crossout will get some usage here, getting rid of that Magician of Faith. And then both players will banish any Magician of Faith remaining in deck. It looks like that is Ellie's one Magician of Faith in graveyard there, besides their profile picture. They're going to set one, and then PJ's just going to eat into that Serpent again. You kind of have to do that every turn. And yeah, they're just going to pass back to Ellie. And that's why the Jinzo draw is why you have to eat into that Serpent every turn, because they can just tribute out to Jinzo potentially. Looks like PJ's going to go for a Jar of Greed here. Attack into their set. I think maybe, honestly, you go for like a Raigeki here. And the reasoning for that is Ellie's at 2,800, so you've got them on a 2-turn clock with the tomato. And Change of Heart plus Raigeki just gives you a way to win. So I think that, honestly, they could have potentially gone for a Raigeki or Change of Heart, hit in, and gotten some value that way. Or not value, but just won the game in like a couple turns. But as is, I mean, that might not have mattered in the end here. They're going to Solemn Judgment, the heavy that Ellie drew off the top. So that means that Ellie is likely also on the Duster in the deck, because you don't play heavy if you can play Duster as well. PJ's going to again attack into the Serpent, and then just pass back to Ellie, not even choosing to fire the Confiscation. I think that's honestly a decent play here, as, you know, you don't really want to spend the 1,000 to pick apart a hand that hadn't been able to do anything to you over the past, like, 3 or 4 turns. But again, I really think PJ should have gone for a Raigeki or Change of Heart here. Just gotten aggressive and potentially won the game. Now Ellie can set the Jar of Greed as a bluff and makes that play a lot worse here. And PJ is going to go for the Confi now, which is interesting. I'm not sure exactly why they chose to do it now instead of last turn, but yeah, they're just going to eat into that Serpent again. And Ellie will grab back the Serpent again, go for a Jar of Greed here. And they're going to fire a Mystical Space Typhoon on the set Mirror Force there, which is a pretty good hit with MST. Ellie's going to set that Serpent again, and now they can go for game. Yeah, they've got game on board for this one turn, and that will be the end of the game. So it didn't actually matter that they didn't go for the Change of Heart. Raigeki plays there. And I guess this does play around Io maybe a little bit, but I don't know. I still liked that sort of play there. But they won anyway, so it doesn't really matter in that case. Ellie will be going first in game 3 here. And while this does give them an advantage, as I said before, you know, it definitely isn't perfect. I mean, PJ went first in the first game of the last match, so it really can go either way. Ellie's going to set the Serpent, set Imperial Order and Torrential Tribute, and pass back to PJ, and that's a really good opening there. Pot of Greed will get fired, but that will eat into the Imperial Order. So PJ is going to set the Mystic Tomato in an Imperial Order of their own, passing back to Ellie. Ellie will pay the 700 because they've got a great play. Oh, interesting. I thought they were going to go for the Jinzo. I mean, I guess this doesn't really matter. They're just going to attack in to the Tomato. PJ will get out a Wish of Black Forest. Ellie will set a Call of the Haunted and just pass back to PJ. PJ is going to set the Sangan, set a Witch, pass back to Ellie here. I guess now maybe you want to go for the Jins. Maybe not. Yeah, you can just eat apart what PJ potentially has set. And yeah, so you don't need to get super aggressive here now, as you don't really have a way to push for damage. But it looks like PJ will tribute over their Witch for a Jinzo here. So they'll get a search. Did they search? I don't think they searched. Let's see here. They tributed the normal summon Jinzo. They didn't search. Okay, that is a mandatory search, so that should have happened. But maybe it won't have affected the game outcome in the end either way here. Or maybe they remember. Oh, no, they don't remember. That could have actually come up. Man, maybe that is... That's interesting. Also, Ellie should not have paid 700 here because Jinzo's on field, so that negates maintenance costs in this format. Okay, yeah, there we go. But they will indeed fire this painful choice here and send some pretty good ones here. They sent 2 Magician of Faith, a Confiscation, a Snatch Steal, and a Heavy, it looks like. Those are pretty good ones. It looks like PJ is going to give them the Confi as they don't really care too much about their hand, maybe, and they're fine just having Ellie pay 1,000 more. Ellie's going to take the Tomato. They're going to MST that Snatch Steal and then buff up that Bazoo pretty highly here. Up to 3,400. They're then going to bring out a Kaiku here, attack into the Jinzo, and attack in for 1,800, or at least attempt to. But yeah, that will go through because Scapegoat is now offline. So they're going to banish the Jinzo and the Witch, pass back to PJ. Solemn Judgment is okay, but it likely won't really do anything here. I mean, I think the Witch Search wouldn't have mattered because of that Confi. But I don't know. It probably wouldn't have mattered. But it looks like Ellie does have a very good position at this point in the game. And they may win, like, pretty soon. It depends on the next couple turns, but I feel like they're in a very, very good spot. So they're going to attack him with Bazoo, attack him with Kaiku, banish 2 more, and then set the Serpent, set a Jar of Greed there, and pass back to PJ. PJ draws a Cyber Jar, which is pretty good, and if anything can get them back in the game, it is that. They're going to go for a Jar of Greed here on Ellie's part, and then they're going to go for the Bazoo here, potentially trying to go for game, as they do almost have it. They're going, oh, I guess not for game, but Cyber Jar will make it so that even if they had tried going for game, it won't actually matter in the end here. So the Cyber Jar will clear the board, and PJ does draw a monster in the form of Gemini Elf, but let's see if Ellie's able to draw a way to deal more damage. Oh, it looks like not. It looks like both players have just drawn a Gemini Elf here, so that's what they'll add to field in attack position. They'll add the remaining cards to hand, and those are some pretty good ones on PJ's part. And also on Ellie's part, because Change of Heart is very strong as well. And with the Jinzo in hand, I feel like Ellie is in a very good position here. But yeah, it looks like they're just going to clear PJ's Gemini Elf there. Monster Reborn here to try and get back a monster, get in for a lot of damage. And it looks like PJ will Solemn Judgment that. Ellie's going to set a Mystical Space Typhoon here, pass back to PJ. PJ is going to set a Mirror Force and a Mystical Space Typhoon. You've got to set multiple cards here to potentially, you know, play around at MST, or I guess Dust Tornado in this case, because I was up, so, you know, MST can't be activated here. But yeah, you don't want to give your opponent knowledge of where the Mirror Force is. So Ellie's going to add back this Serpent here, and they're going to think about what to do, and they are going to let the Imperial Order lapse. I think that's good here because you can potentially go for game with a Heartbeats here. Unfortunately, you know, PJ does have the IO, but Ellie does have the Mystical Space Typhoon to clear that IO. It looks like PJ is also going to chain a Scapegoat here, but I don't think it will actually matter because they do have the Raigeki in hand. And yeah, that'll let Ellie summon out this Gemini Elf and attack in for game. So wow, very intense games here. It managed to go to a 3rd game in each match, and yeah, these were really intense. I think that this game 3 shows why I'm not the biggest fan of Cyberjar, honestly. I mean, Cyberjar can clear away the board, but this format is so explosive and sacky that it can also give your opponent the tools they need just to OTK you on that turn or the next one. So I'm not the hugest fan of Cyberjar, but I do think it's a very interesting inclusion and should see experimentation. But yeah, major shout out to both duelists in these games. I think that these were very, very good games, and both of these players are very, very good duelists. But now that we've shown off the finals, there are some things that I want to discuss about this tournament as a whole. So let's dive into a bit of a tournament report for this format. So for this breakdown, you can find it on the Format Library website. I'll put a link to it in the description down below if you want to see it for yourself. But it was kind of interesting. There were only 12 players, which makes it kind of hard to judge what the meta for this format looks like based on the results of this tournament. Especially given this format is so high variance and like sacking can occur like pretty much every game. But I do think that we can glean some sort of insights from this. Uh, First off, the deck breakdown, Tomato Control was the dominant deck in the format. And I do think that, like, not every deck with Tomato Control, this deck type representation says that everyone is. But I do know that there was at least one deck that was not. So, maybe there were some other decks that weren't quite Tomato Control that got classified that way anyways. But I do think the Tomato Control or sort of like be Spellcaster good stuff is still the dominant deck in this format, just like it was in Android. And I do think it's honestly the best deck in the format. I mean, both of the top two players were on this Tomato Control sort of good stuff deck, and I think for good reason, as it's just so strong. And as I mentioned in my finals commentary, there are other decks like Hayabusa OTK, which can just blow out your opponent out of nowhere and be pretty decent. But the good stuff deck can also do that, so I don't really think it's worth playing Hayabusa. I will however mention that the third place player in this tournament was on Hayabusa OTK, and that was Air Falco, and they joined the tournament with this deck. Now, there are some sort of flaws in this deck that, they've been talking to other Hayabusa OTK players, and they sort of say that they have some things to update the deck in the future. So maybe in the future, this deck can do better and actually like win the tournament, or potentially put up a better result in a tournament with more people. But while a third place finish does seem somewhat impressive, I do think it's important to temper that excitement with actually looking at how many games they won and lost. So if we look at the full bracket here, Air Falco did have a bye round 1. And that means that ultimately they won 2 matches and then they lost 2 matches here. So they went 50-50 with their win rate, and I feel like that's not that impressive, honestly, in terms of like whether this thing would be a tier 1 deck or not. And Air Falco is a very good player, so I don't think that this was like misplaced on their part or anything. I think it's just an inherent weakness of the deck. In a long tournament, especially a tournament with more people, you will likely pull off your combo at some point and win the game. But I do think that you just can't consistently win as much as other decks that are more tier 1. So I do think that Hayabusa OTK is still not tier 1 in my opinion of it. You can definitely disagree and take the third place finish here to mean that, oh, this deck is actually a tier 1, meta threat. But I still am unconvinced. I still think it's a bit too fragile for at least long periods of tournament play. I do think it's definitely tier 2 at least. Because it can just win out of nowhere if it assembles its combo, and the Gracefuls and all these sacky sort of, destruction cards and things like that can really enable you to do that. However, I just don't think this deck is quite tier 1 at this point. But outside of that spicy brew, the format was just Tomato Control based, but I do think that inside of the Tomato Control good stuff pile, there are some very interesting things that you can look at, especially with these top 2 decks. So starting with PJ's deck, I want to point out something interesting here, which is the Offerings to the Doomed, which is a quick play spell that can play around Jinzo. And I think that's pretty neat. It also is reactive. You can play it from hand, which is nice. And while the loss of a draw is really frustrating sometimes, I do think with the amount of draw power in this format, it potentially isn't the worst thing in the world. I think it is something to potentially experiment with here. I also do like the Jars of Greeds over something like Thunder Dragons. Now, when I was testing out this format with my good stuff decks, I was playing 3 copies of Thunder Dragon because it does pair very well with Graceful, but unlike in future formats like GOAT, there's a lot less you can do with Thunder Dragon once it hits the grave. And while there are some things you can do in hand with it, like, potentially tributing over something for a change of heart, I do think that it's really not that impressive. So I do like going for the Jars of Greeds here over something like a Thunder Dragon. You can send those off of the Painfuls as well to deck them a bit more. You can always sort of use them as a pitch off the Graceful if you really need a low impact card to pitch. But yeah, I like Jars of Greeds. I hope that people experiment with them more in the future of this format. Another important thing to note, the 3 Magician of Faith here, this actually differs from Ellie's build of the deck, which is only playing 1 Magician of Faith. And I do think that Magician of Faith is very good this format for getting back powerful spells like Graceful Charity. That can be pretty insane. But you know, whether to do 3 or 1 or even maybe 2 is a matter of debate. I think that this tournament is a very good indication of that debate in action. And I think that, you know, this doesn't necessarily prove that 3 Magician of Faith is worse than 1. I think it's definitely something to experiment with more in the future. Also, I want to mention PJ's sort of beater lineup here. They've got 1 Kaiku, 1 Bazoo, and 3 Gemini Elf, which is very interesting here. Yeah, I'm unsure why exactly they went with this sort of orientation. I guess Gemini Elf is just generally good in pretty much all situations that it can beat over like a Kaiku, because Bazoo needs graveyard setup, and also it can't beat over Kaiku in general. And Kaiku is very threatening for things like Sinister Serpent, so I guess PJ is like, well, we're playing 3 Gemini Elf, as you can just always bring it out, attack in, get that 1900 damage in, or just hit over a Kaiku to stop something like a Serpent Banish. So I guess that might be why they did it, but I don't know. I think that this ratio of beaters is definitely something to experiment with more in the future. It'll be interesting to see what ratio Ellie used. Before we move on to Ellie's deck, I also want to point out this ratio of trap holes and torrentials here. Trap hole versus torrential is sort of a debate that goes on in Android and Joey-Pegasus format. As, you know, trap hole is very good at destroying your opponent's monster that might be beating over your beater, while also preserving your beater, whereas Torrential Tribute is good at just stopping a massive amount of aggressive pressure. I do personally prefer Trap Hole in Android format, as I do think that preserving the beater triangle is very good, but I think in Joey-Pegasus there's a lot more debate here, given things like Scapegoat do exist, so Torrential can be very good versus that. However, I do think that having the 1 Trap Hole, 1 Torrential can make it tough for your opponent to know what to play around, and so it is very interesting to go with this ratio, and we'll see if Ellie went with that ratio as well. Speaking of Ellie's deck, let's just dive into that. Let's look at this tomato control list. And this is a very sort of different list here. Whereas PJ opted to go for 3 Magician of Faith, Ellie went for a lot of beaters. And I do think that going for a lot of beaters is very good in this format. You've got so many sacky ways to clear your opponent's stuff that if you can just get aggressive with these beaters, it can be very, very nice. So whereas PJ leaned in more for the control aspect of the deck, Ellie's going more aggro, and aggro did win out this tournament, although as we saw in those matches, it definitely could have gone either way. Another interesting thing to note here is that Ellie is not playing the tomatoes in the main deck, which is pretty interesting. A lot of people do play tomatoes to bring out the witches and the Sangans while also preserving board presence and potentially giving you a tribute for something like Jinzo here. But Ellie's not playing those in the main, they're just playing them in the side. Maybe to bring in against decks that are playing the 3 tomatoes, just so you can actually like crash into them. But it is an interesting choice in the main deck here, and it seems to be one that worked out for them, and I can definitely see why that is. So definitely interesting to experiment with, and I'm curious to see if people will also experiment with them more in the future. Some other interesting things here is that Ellie is playing both Heavy Storm and a Harpy's Feather Duster in the main deck alongside 3 MSTs, just going like all in on spell and trap removal. This is very interesting. I generally prefer the ratio of 3 MST and like 1 Harpies, just to provide the threat of a mass board clear, but also the MSTs are much more valuable, so I like having them in. But yeah, I guess the Heavy Storm can also surprise people who aren't expecting another mass board wipe after the Harpy's Feather Duster is gone, so it can be good in that regard as well. But very interesting choice here, and it did work out for them, it seems like. Also, 3 Jar of Greed here, just like PJ was on the 2 Jar of Greed instead of Thunder Dragon. Ellie's also doing this strat, and I do think that the results of this tournament do imply that the Jar of Greeds are a bit better than Thunder Dragons overall. Now, again, this was a small tournament, so definitely not the end-all be-all for this discussion, and this debate will likely continue in the future. However, the fact that both of the top players in this tournament did play the Jars of Greed without the Thunder Dragons, and the fact that Thunder Dragon can be a brick in your hand really does sort of, lean in Jar of Greed's favor. Another interesting thing to note here is the Skull Lair. This is a card that was played a lot in Android format, but not really as much in Joey-Pegasus format. And it looks like Ellie is playing it here and maybe got some success with it, although I think they said after the tournament that it was definitely like the iffiest card in their deck. I think. Don't quote me on that. I'm just pretty sure that they said it. There was a lot of discussion about the metagame in Joey-Pegasus after the tournament wrapped up, and I'm pretty sure that was a comment that I saw, but definitely correct me if I'm wrong. Ellie, if you're watching this video, let me know down in the comments below your thoughts on the deck and whether you actually said that or not. Last interesting things that I want to note with this deck are the monster removal cards here. Ellie's choosing to play 2 Torrentials, not even playing a Trap Hole at all, just valuing the board weight of Torrential over the sort of controlling nature of Trap Hole, and I think that makes a lot of sense, given that they've got so many beaters here. They don't really care about clearing the board, especially because a lot of decks are cutting down on the number of beaters like PJ's deck was. And so the Torrential Tributes are very good here at just keeping aggressive pressure and also providing a defensive option in cases where things are going south. In addition, they've also got a Fisher to get even more aggressive, clearing your opponent's beaters and just getting in with the beaters you've got. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And I know that I said that that was the last thing that I want to talk about here, but one last note, because there is so many interesting things to talk about in this format, is that there's no Scapegoat in the main deck as well. Scapegoat's been a card that's seen some play in these sort of tomato control good stuff decks, and Ellie chose not to play it in the main or the side deck. So an interesting choice, but it did work out for them here. And I'm curious to see if that will lead to more people cutting Scapegoat from their decks in the future. But that's going to do it for my coverage of this format and for this video. I was debating making a Joey-Pegasus tier list after, this tournament wrapped up. But I honestly think that would be kind of boring, as it seems like the tier 1 deck, the main tier 1 deck, is just tomato control. So basically kind of like a tier 0 deck, even though Hayabusa Knight OTK can actually win a game here or there. But let me know down in the comments below if you do actually want a Joey-Pegasus tier list video, or if you just want me to dive back into fiber format, which I am very excited to do, especially given the tournament coming up this Saturday. If you do want to see more of those fiber format videos when they come out, the best way to do that is to subscribe. And if you want to see more videos in Joey-Pegasus format or any of the other formats that I've covered, let me know down in the comments below. But I hope you enjoyed the video as always, and until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.